The night of March 8, 2014, began like any other in the skies above Southeast Asia. At 12:41 a.m., Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370, a Boeing 777, lifted off from Kuala Lumpur International Airport. Its destination: Beijing, China. On board were 239 souls, men, women, and children, families, students, workers, and crew, each with a story, each expecting an ordinary flight across the South China Sea. But within hours, this flight would become the center of the greatest aviation mystery of the modern era. Somewhere between Malaysia and Vietnam, MH370 vanished from radar screens. Without a distress call, without a warning, without a trace. It wasn't just a disappearance. It was a vanishing act so complete, so sudden, that it felt as if the airplane had been swallowed whole by the night sky itself. And as the minutes turned into hours, and the hours stretched into days, one question echoed louder than all others. How does a modern aircraft, tracked by satellites, monitored by radar, and watched by air traffic controllers, simply disappear? The story of MH370 is not just about a plane. It is about a search that spanned oceans, governments, and years. It is about families left with unanswered questions and investigators left chasing shadows across the globe. It is a story of hope, despair, silence, and secrets. And it all began with a sound no one expected to hear: silence. The night air above Kuala Lumpur was thick with humidity, yet at the airport everything moved with the practiced rhythm of routine. Flight crews gathered, ground staff hustled across the tarmac, and passengers drifted through the glowing corridors of the terminal, some sleepy, some eager, all carrying stories that would never fully be told. Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 was scheduled to depart just after midnight on March 8, 2014. To the 239 souls boarding, it was supposed to be a straightforward journey. A red-eye flight from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing, crossing the South China Sea in the dark and landing with the sunrise. There was nothing extraordinary about the plane or the route. The Boeing 777-200ER itself was a trusted machine, one of the most reliable aircraft in commercial aviation. With over a decade of service, it had logged thousands of hours without incident. Its twin Rolls-Royce engines were capable of carrying it across oceans and continents with ease. If there was ever a symbol of safety in modern air travel, the 777 was it. The captain that night was Zahari Ahmad Shah, a veteran pilot with more than 18,000 hours of flying experience. Known for his calm demeanor and technical skill, Zahari was admired by colleagues and trusted by passengers who never knew his name. Alongside him sat First Officer Farik Hamid, young, just 27, completing one of his final training flights before becoming fully certified. Between them, they were the guardians of the night, steady hands guiding a steel bird into the dark. Passengers boarded with the small, mundane details that made the flight feel so ordinary. Families returning home. Businessmen reviewing contracts under the cabin lights. Students with heavy backpacks and heavier dreams. Couples asleep before the wheels even left the runway. Every face a story. Every story about to be interrupted. At 12:41 a.m., Flight MH370 lifted off the runway, its landing gear folding neatly beneath the belly. Kuala Lumpur shrank into a mosaic of lights below. The plane angled north, its nose pointed toward Beijing. For the first 40 minutes, everything followed the script of normalcy. The crew exchanged routine communications with Malaysian air traffic control. The passengers settled in, lulled by the quiet hum of engines and the dimmed lights of the cabin. From the outside, MH370 was just one of dozens of anonymous blips moving steadily across radar screens. At 1:07 a.m., the plane sent its final ACARS transmission, the automated system that relays engine and flight data. Nothing unusual was reported, just another packet of numbers, another piece of routine. Minutes later, as the aircraft approached the boundary between Malaysian and Vietnamese airspace, Captain Zahari's calm voice came over the radio. "Good night, Malaysian 370. It was 1:19 a.m. The last words ever heard from the cockpit. What followed is where the normal faded and the unexplainable began. At 1:21 a.m., just 2 minutes after that radio call, the plane's transponder, the device that broadcasts its position to civilian radar, went dark. In an instant, MH370 disappeared from the radar screens used by air traffic controllers. To the controllers watching, it was as if the plane had simply ceased to exist. One moment, it was there, glowing as a small green dot. The next, it was gone, swallowed by the night sky. At first, no alarm was raised. Transponders can fail, signals can drop, pilots can switch frequencies. In the silence of the control rooms, controllers expected the plane to check in again when it crossed into Vietnamese airspace. But the call never came. The passengers inside MH370 remained unaware. They sat in the quiet cocoon of the cabin, reading, dreaming, dozing. They had no way of knowing that outside, their plane was vanishing not just from screens, but from history itself. Airplanes are not supposed to disappear. Not in the 21st century. Not with satellites orbiting overhead, radar sweeping the skies, and entire networks built to track every flight from takeoff to landing. Yet in those early minutes past 1:20 a.m., Flight MH370 slipped silently from the world's grasp. It was the moment when routine ended, and a mystery unlike any other began. When the radar screens at Kuala Lumpur's Air Traffic Control Center showed the blinking signal of Flight MH370 vanish without warning, the first reaction was disbelief. These things don't just happen. Planes don't just vanish. Yet that's exactly what had occurred. Controllers scrambled, voices tight with confusion, calling out the flight code again and again into the void. Malaysia 370, do you copy? Malaysia 370, please respond. No reply, no static, no distress call, nothing. The radar blip had simply dissolved into the black canvas of the night sky. And with it, so too began one of the greatest mysteries in modern aviation. The initial minutes were marked by hesitation. Commercial flights do sometimes drop off secondary radar. A glitch, a system hiccup, a communication error. Pilots usually re-establish contact within minutes. But as 10 minutes passed, then 20, silence deepened into dread. Every unanswered call echoed like an omen. And while control towers in Kuala Lumpur wrestled with confusion, in Beijing, thousands of kilometers away, families were gathering at the airport's arrival gate, holding bouquets, banners, and cameras, waiting for loved ones who would never arrive. The vanishing wasn't just a line on a radar. It was an entire web of lives, frozen in a moment that refused explanation. But what nobody knew at that exact hour was this. MH370 had not simply vanished, it had deviated. Because somewhere between the last civilian radar ping and the silence, the Boeing 777 had made a sharp, deliberate turn, veering west, back across the Malaysian peninsula. This maneuver was not random turbulence or malfunction. It was intentional. Someone in that cockpit had changed the plane's course, and that revelation turned a tragedy into a riddle. Was this the work of hijackers, taking control of the plane under the cover of night? Was it the captain, Zahari Ahmad Shah, a man with decades of flying experience, suddenly acting out of some unknown motive? Or was it a technical catastrophe, unfolding in a way that mimicked human hands on the controls? Every possible answer raised more questions than it solved. For the families in Beijing and Kuala Lumpur, hours turned into days of unbearable waiting. Each passing moment seemed to stretch the silence further, as if the world itself were conspiring to hold back the truth. Search and rescue operations began frantically in the South China Sea, the assumed crash zone based on the last known position. Naval ships, surveillance planes, and satellites scoured the waters. But there was nothing. No wreckage, no oil slick, not a single floating seat cushion. It was as if the ocean had swallowed the Boeing whole. And then came the most chilling twist. Military radar data showed the plane hadn't gone down in the South China Sea at all. It had crossed the Malay Peninsula, flown over the Strait of Malacca, and disappeared once again into the Indian Ocean. It was a trail that seemed to mock investigators, a ghost flight, zigzagging through the skies, always staying just out of reach. Every new revelation was like a cruel trick. Hope ignited, only to collapse into another dead end. And with each passing day, one haunting question grew louder. How can a modern aircraft, in an age of satellites and global surveillance, simply vanish without a trace? The world had seen disappearances before, but nothing like this. By the morning of March 8, 2014, Flight MH370 wasn't just a lost aircraft. It was a riddle that mocked every radar, every satellite, and every law of probability. At first, investigators followed the obvious. The South China Sea was combed relentlessly. Fleets of ships, squadrons of aircraft, and international crews scoured the waters east of Malaysia. They were certain they would find something. Wreckage, floating life vests, perhaps even survivors, but the sea gave nothing. Not a single scrap of debris surfaced. It was as if the Boeing 777 had dissolved into the night sky. And that silence, the absence of evidence, was deafening. For the families waiting at Kuala Lumpur International Airport, the silence became unbearable. News outlets swarmed the terminals, broadcasting images of parents, children, and spouses gripping phones, eyes red from sleepless nights. The most advanced planes in the world did not simply vanish in the 21st century, or so they thought. But as hours turned into days, the narrative shifted. This was not a crash in the South China Sea. Something else had happened. The trail began to curve when military radar data surfaced. Malaysia's defense authorities hesitated, but eventually revealed that their military radars had detected what appeared to be MH370 turning back, cutting across the Malay Peninsula, flying over the Straits of Malacca, and vanishing into the Andaman Sea. The world gasped. The disappearance was no accident of navigation. It was deliberate. Someone in the cockpit had changed course. The thought was chilling. Investigators suddenly faced two possibilities: a catastrophic technical failure forcing pilots into desperate maneuvers, or an intentional act, a hijacking, or worse, a planned suicide mission. Neither explanation sat comfortably, but one thing was now certain. Flight MH370 did not go down in the waters where everyone had been looking. By the end of that week, the investigation had ballooned into one of the largest aviation searches in history. 26 nations offered ships, planes, and intelligence resources. But with every passing day, the question grew louder. Where had MH370 gone? The breakthrough came not from the skies, but from the cold stream of digital signals. A British company, Inmarsat, revealed something extraordinary. Although the plane's transponder and communications had been deliberately switched off, the aircraft's satellite communication system had continued to handshake with satellites orbiting the Earth. These handshakes did not provide location directly, but they gave timing, arcs, curves on a map that pointed to where the aircraft might have flown. It was a revelation both stunning and horrifying. The satellite data suggested that after crossing Malaysia, MH370 flew for 6 more hours, 6 hours, across the Indian Ocean into emptiness. For 6 hours, the plane remained aloft, engines roaring, as though nothing were wrong. For 6 hours, passengers and crew were somewhere inside that fuselage, while families slept in their beds halfway across the world, unaware that an unimaginable mystery was already unfolding in the sky. That realization struck like lightning. The plane hadn't just vanished, it had kept flying. But where? Analysts traced two potential arcs: northward over Thailand, Myanmar, and deep into Central Asia; southward into the endless waters of the Indian Ocean. The northern route implied it would have crossed heavily monitored airspace. Someone, somewhere, would have seen it. Yet no radar, no military base, no government reported such a sighting. That left only the south, into the vast, featureless expanse of the Indian Ocean. An area so remote that some parts had never been mapped in detail. A graveyard where a plane could vanish forever. And just like that, the investigation pivoted. The South China Sea search was abandoned. The world's eyes turned to the Indian Ocean. But with that pivot came something even more unsettling. If the plane had flown south for 6 hours across one of the most desolate regions on Earth, what did that mean about those on board? Were they alive during those hours? Conscious? Or were they long gone? The cabin unpressurized, the passengers asleep forever while the plane glided on autopilot into oblivion. The families demanded answers, but the answers only deepened the shadows. The Indian Ocean is not kind. Its depths swallow light, its waves crush steel, its storms batter even the most advanced ships. Searching there was like looking for a single grain of sand on a shifting desert floor. Yet hope persisted. Because every mystery, no matter how large, leaves a trace. Or so they believed. The world's greatest aviation riddle had now split into two burning questions. Who had diverted MH370? And where, in the vastness of the Indian Ocean, had it come to rest? As satellites drew invisible arcs across the globe, the story of MH370 crossed from the realm of accident into something darker, more haunting. A ghost flight. A machine that carried 239 souls into a place where truth itself dissolved. And the deeper the investigators probed, the more sinister the silence became. Because a vanishing act this perfect felt almost like design. For hours, Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370 drifted somewhere over the open ocean. But to whom did it truly belong during those last, chilling stretches of flight? The aircraft, once bustling with 239 souls, had effectively become a ghost in the sky. No radio calls, no distress signals, no signs of struggle, only silence. The absence of communication was not simply unusual, it was haunting. Pilots in emergencies are trained to say something, anything, even if only seconds remain. Yet MH370 remained mute, gliding through the night like an abandoned vessel carried by invisible currents. And so the question lingers. Was the silence intentional? Or was the crew and every passenger on board already beyond help? Radar data later revealed that after communication was cut, the plane performed unexpected maneuvers. It turned west, then looped back over Malaysia, crossing over Penang Island. A maneuver so precise it suggested deliberate control. One theory imagines the captain making a final silent farewell, skimming close to his hometown before vanishing into darkness. Another proposes hijackers at the helm, navigating away from crowded airspaces. Still others whisper that the plane was flying itself, guided only by autopilot, a ghostly trajectory written by algorithms rather than human hands. Each explanation carries with it dread, because none explain why a plane filled with people would continue flying, eerily intact, yet utterly unreachable. As the minutes turned into hours, MH370 pushed into one of the loneliest stretches of sky in the world. The Indian Ocean loomed, vast, unforgiving, empty. Commercial radar coverage ended, leaving the aircraft untraceable to civilian eyes. But one shadow of its presence remained: the satellite handshakes. Every hour, the aircraft systems automatically pinged a communication satellite, confirming that it still lived, still moved, still breathed through machinery. No voice accompanied these ghostly signals. No coordinates were transmitted, just mechanical acknowledgments. Pings echoing into space like faint heartbeats of a machine trying to remind the world it was still alive. Imagine the horror. Knowing that somewhere, high above the ocean, 239 lives still hurtled forward, unseen, unheard, trapped inside a ghost ship of the sky. The pings carried on for nearly 7 hours after MH370's disappearance. 7 hours in which the plane might have crossed nations, oceans, even continents. And yet no one knew. This prolonged life beyond vanishing gave birth to one of the most haunting elements of the mystery: the ghost flight itself. A jetliner in motion, its passengers perhaps unconscious or already gone, its destination unknown, its purpose erased. A sky-borne phantom following an invisible arc. Was the cockpit empty during this silent journey? Were the pilots locked in an impossible battle against catastrophe? Or was the plane's trajectory pre-programmed by unseen hands, tracing its course like a message left behind? The sheer emptiness of those hours chills investigators to this day. For the families, the thought that their loved ones remained in the sky, alive or otherwise, long after the last words were spoken. Goodnight Malaysian 370 is almost unbearable. To them, the flight did not vanish in an instant. It lingered, suspended, dragging its mystery across the sky, like a candle burning, down unseen. And when at last the final ping ceased, the world was left only with silence, an absence more terrifying than an explosion or a crash. Because silence meant choice. Silence meant time. Silence meant a ghost in the sky had traveled far, but no one could say where. MH370 was gone, and yet, not gone. For weeks, the search had expanded into the vast waters of the Indian Ocean, each day stretching hope thinner until it became almost transparent. The world had grown accustomed to dramatic rescues, to the neat closure of disaster narratives. But MH370 seemed determined to defy this pattern. It was as though the aircraft had slipped into a parallel silence, a silence so complete that even the most advanced machines could not pierce it. The satellite pings, those faint, almost accidental echoes of the plane's existence, were all investigators had left. They suggested that the aircraft had continued flying for hours after losing contact. That detail gnawed at everyone. Why keep flying? And toward what? The Indian Ocean, deeper than most human comprehension, had swallowed the truth whole. The haunting part wasn't only the disappearance, but the possibility of awareness. If the plane kept flying, did the passengers know? Were they asleep, drugged, unconscious, or awake, watching time stretch into an endless descent? Every unanswered question carried a darker possibility, and in that darkness, speculation grew wild. This wasn't just a missing flight. It was a mirror reflecting humanity's deepest fear, the terror of vanishing without explanation, without trace, without goodbye. The families lived inside this silence. For them, each unanswered call, each closed lead was a reopening wound. They gathered in halls, clutching photographs, demanding not only answers but truth. Yet the truth seemed to dissolve the closer one got to it, like mist in sunlight. Officials offered timelines and coordinates, but the explanations felt like fragile scaffolding built on air. For the families, truth had to mean something human, a reason, a story, a face to blame. Without that, there was only the silence. Meanwhile, whispers began to seep into public conversation. Stories of shadowy military bases, of a hijacking covered up, of a ghost plane wandering the skies longer than anyone dared admit. Each theory seemed too wild, and yet, against the impossible backdrop of the plane's disappearance, none could be dismissed outright. The silence of the ocean gave these theories room to live, to grow, to infect imagination. In the years that followed, fragments washed ashore on distant beaches, pieces of wing flaps, cabin panels, scraps of the plane's body. These were not answers, only reminders of the enormity of the absence. Each fragment seemed to whisper, yes, it was real, it existed, it broke. But none revealed how or why. Instead, the ocean seemed to taunt those searching, scattering breadcrumbs across the coasts of Africa and the islands of the Indian Ocean. Enough to confirm the loss, never enough to confirm the truth. And so MH370 became something larger than a tragedy. It became a symbol of modern fragility, of how even in a world of satellites and surveillance, an aircraft, a metal giant carrying 239 souls, could vanish into the void. It was not just a failure of technology, but a fracture in human certainty. If we could lose something so large, so modern, what else could slip away unseen? What else could disappear into silence while the world kept moving on? The world was forced to admit something terrifying. Sometimes, even in the 21st century, mysteries remain mysteries. The world had long since moved on. News cycles turned, headlines faded, and other tragedies filled the void where MH370 once dominated. Yet for those who had loved ones aboard, time had become stuck, frozen in the hours after March 8, 2014. It was as though the clock had refused to move forward, the second hand permanently jammed between loss and hope. By the 7th week after the disappearance, satellites, search planes, and naval fleets had combed through vast swathes of the Indian Ocean. What they found was both everything and nothing. Pings of possible wreckage that disappeared as quickly as they surfaced. False alarms sparked by oil slicks, radar anomalies, or floating garbage mistaken for debris. Each discovery burned bright for a fleeting moment, igniting hope, only to fade into yet another cruel dead end. And with every false lead, The ocean seemed to mock humanity's attempts to pry open its secrets. But for the families, the cruelest part wasn't the silence. It was the fragments. A barnacle-crusted flaperon washing ashore on Réunion Island in 2015. A torn piece of wing found on Madagascar. Bits of cabin interior drifting up on the coasts of Mozambique and Tanzania. Each object was tangible proof that something catastrophic had happened. Yet at the same time, these scraps raised even more unbearable questions. Where was the rest of the aircraft? Where were the bodies? Why was the sea returning only fragments, as though it were deliberately rationing out the truth? This strange rhythm, the partial evidence, the incomplete story, drove the families into a kind of madness. Some clung to theories that the plane had been hijacked and hidden, alive somewhere in the shadowy margins of the earth. Others surrendered to darker beliefs, that their loved ones were now resting beneath miles of crushing black water, locked in a silent tomb that would never be disturbed. And amid all this, the ocean itself became less a body of water and more a character in the story, a presence. The Indian Ocean, vast, merciless, and indifferent, stood as the ultimate adversary. Radar could be tricked, satellites could miss their marks, and ships could scan for years, but the ocean always won. Always hiding, always devouring. Investigators grew frustrated. Algorithms mapped possible crash zones based on fuel burn, satellite arcs, and automated handshakes between the aircraft and ground systems. The famous seventh arc, the final electronic whisper from MH370, was plotted across a desolate stretch of water west of Australia. It was there, experts insisted, that the plane had fallen. Yet months of searching with the most advanced sonar and underwater drones revealed nothing but a bleak underworld of trenches, ridges, and volcanic scars. It was as though the sea had folded the aircraft into itself, absorbing it whole, leaving behind no scar to mark its violence. But silence, no matter how deep, only breeds speculation. Soon the narrative split into two distinct currents. On one side, the scientific, methodical investigators insisting that the plane had simply run out of fuel and nosedived into the ocean. On the other, the theorists who saw patterns, anomalies, and shadows in the data, clues that hinted at something far stranger, something unspoken. And caught between these currents were the families. One widow put it best in a trembling voice at a memorial. "It is not the ocean that has swallowed them, it is the truth." The silence of MH370 wasn't natural. It was engineered, by human hands, by systems designed to protect, by institutions that feared revealing what they might have known. For if the ocean was complicit in hiding the plane, it had powerful allies on land. And so, as the search dragged on, the mystery shifted. The question was no longer just, where is MH370, but who is silencing its story? By the time the official investigations began to stall, the vacuum left in the public's understanding was quickly filled with something else: conjecture. And not just the idle speculation of conspiracy theorists in dark corners of the internet, but a tidal wave of theories, each more haunting than the last. Some pointed to deliberate action, that someone on board had decided the flight's fate long before it ever left the runway. The captain, Zahari Ahmad Shah, became the subject of relentless scrutiny. Investigators tore through his personal life, his financial records, his flight simulator at home. On that simulator, they found something chilling. A route eerily similar to the suspected path MH370 might have taken, out over the Indian Ocean, ending in a remote and desolate stretch of water. Was this coincidence? A pilot's idle curiosity? Or a rehearsal for something darker? The question hung heavy, unanswered, and tainted every memory of the man once respected as a veteran aviator. Others believed it wasn't Zahari, but an outside force, hijacking. But how? Who could commandeer a modern Boeing 777 without a single Mayday call, without anyone in the cabin noticing? Some suggested shadowy operatives. Others whispered about cargo in the hold that was worth silencing an entire aircraft for. Military-grade equipment, sensitive materials. And then came the geopolitical theories, that the plane was diverted deliberately, not by a rogue pilot, but by powers far larger than anyone dared to name aloud. Why else, they asked, would so many nations hesitate, stall, or contradict one another in the search effort? Was it incompetence, or something calculated? And still others looked toward the passengers themselves. Among the 239 souls were engineers, artists, students, entire families. But tucked among them were men linked to advanced technologies, patents, defense contracts. Enough to stir imaginations. Was MH370 silenced because of something or someone it carried? But perhaps the darkest theory of all was also the simplest. That the passengers, awake in those long, final hours, knew their fate. Imagine the cabin, dark, oxygen thinning, silence replacing the hum of conversation. Mothers clutching children, strangers whispering prayers, couples holding hands. That they drifted into unconsciousness as the plane cruised on, a flying coffin, until it fell into the sea with no witnesses. Every theory carried its own shadow, its own unbearable weight. And yet, for all their variety, they shared one common thread. None could be proven. And that is the cruelest truth of MH370. The certainty of tragedy, married to the absence of explanation. The ocean became both a grave and a shield, hiding what humanity most craved: closure. And in that vacuum, the theories only grew louder, more fevered, until MH370 was no longer just a tragedy, but a stage for the world's deepest fears. And yet, behind all the noise, behind every headline and whispered theory, the same haunting silence persisted. A silence as wide and deep as the Indian Ocean itself. As weeks turned into months, the narrative around Flight MH370 shifted from urgent rescue to historical enigma. The ocean, vast and merciless, had swallowed evidence whole. Families who once sat in fluorescent-lit rooms clutching onto scraps of updates were now left with silence, an emptiness louder than any official statement. Some moved toward resignation, convinced their loved ones had perished in the southern seas. Others clung desperately to alternative theories, rejecting the ocean's grave. Every flicker of possible debris that washed ashore reignited fragile hope. A piece of wing found on Reunion Island in 2015, a barnacle-encrusted flaperon, was confirmed as part of MH370. But it wasn't closure. Instead, it was salt in the wound, proof that fragments of truth existed, while the body of the story remained hidden. Investigators released a 495-page report, packed with technical analysis, radar trails, and cockpit procedures. But even this colossal document ended with a void. The team is unable to determine the real cause for the disappearance. For the families, it was another layer of torment. And yet, within that silence grew something stranger, an obsession that stretched beyond families and into the world. Forums buzzed. Amateur sleuths pored over flight maps, weather patterns, satellite imagery. The mystery had outgrown aviation. It was now myth, feeding the same fire that once surrounded lost cities and vanished explorers. Still, for those directly touched, it was not myth. It was the rawest form of grief, a grief without a body, without ritual, without end. Some carried on with quiet dignity, while others lived suspended, neither in mourning nor in acceptance. The silence weighed heavier than any conclusion could have. For what is more haunting, the loss of a plane or the loss of truth itself? And so the world stood on the shoreline of this mystery, gazing into an endless sea that kept its answers hidden. But just when it seemed the story was finally settling into history's shadows, strange ripples began to surface. Clues, fragments, and whispers that threatened to change everything once again. The South Indian Ocean. A place so vast, so desolate, it might as well be another world. Waves crash endlessly against themselves, unmarked by human presence, save for the rare freighter that cuts through its surface. And somewhere beneath those waters, if the official story is to be believed, lies the final resting place of a Boeing 777 and the souls of 239 passengers. But there is a reason this story has not faded. Because unlike so many tragedies of the air, this one has no closure. Governments declared it lost. Families were told to grieve. The world moved on, but the ocean, silent and inscrutable, has never given up its secrets. No full wreckage, no black box, no definitive answer, just fragments, whispers, and theories that scatter like debris in a storm. In Kuala Lumpur, some families still gather. They bring flowers to memorials, they hold vigils, they light candles, and each time the flame flickers, it is as though they are asking, what really happened up there? Was it mechanical failure cloaked in chaos? A rogue pilot's unspeakable choice? A hijacking? A cyber attack? Or something stranger? Something not yet understood? The truth remains suspended, caught in the space between possibility and silence. Imagine the final moments of MH370. The cabin quiet, save for the low hum of engines. Rows of passengers asleep, unaware that their journey was already lost to time. A cockpit lit only by soft instrument glow, where choices, human or otherwise, shaped a mystery that would ripple across the entire world. And then, the fade. No distress call, no explanation, just disappearance. Every aviation tragedy carries a record, a footprint of its fall. But MH370 is different. It is a wound that does not heal because the scar itself was never found. Some call it the ghost flight. Others, the vanishing act of the century. And maybe that is what unsettles us most. Not just the lives cut short, but the silence that follows. The idea that in an age of satellites, radars, and global connectivity, something so large could vanish into the void. That a plane could slip between the cracks of human knowledge. That if it happened once, it could happen again. And so, the story lives on. In late-night forums where strangers trade theories, in documentaries that revisit the same shadows, in families who cannot stop searching, because to stop searching would mean accepting the unacceptable. As the waves of the Indian Ocean continue their eternal motion, they guard their secret. The truth, if it exists down there, remains buried in the cold, crushing depths. And maybe that's the final haunting of Flight MH370. Not the tragedy itself, but the silence that follows, louder than any scream. A silence that asks, how much do we really know? Because sometimes, the greatest mysteries are not found in the stars above, but in the skies we thought we had already conquered. And until the ocean speaks, Flight MH370 remains suspended in that silence.